Okay, so we are live, the second round. Let's just check if everyone can see us and are able to join this link. Okay, YouTube is sending.
Yes, because on LinkedIn, we're still not live. At least we're not visible, let's say it that way.
Oh, I just got a notification saying Viber is live. Okay, so let's just share this. Oh. Okay, I think he has generated a new link, which I have just popped in the chat. So I can see we've got 7 people and the digit is going up. So we do have people joining us. So we'll give it a few moments, just a minute or two. Thank you so much all for your patience and for bearing with us and rejoining. Oh, perfect. We've got some comments coming through as well. Good morning, good hello, good afternoon, everyone. Just checking that you can actually see us this time around. You're all live. Perfect. Great news. Thank you so much. And apologies for the technical issue. Always comes first time for that as well. So as we've lost a little bit of time, I will make the introduction a little bit shorter. And all I'm going to say is just sort of remind why we've come together today, specifically talking about the topic of perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for confirming that you can see and hear us. Thank you. But in terms of why we're here today, why are we going to be talking about emotional intelligence and emotional literacy specifically when there is so much going on in the world, when there are so many other things that we could be talking about? Why have we picked this topic? And before I realized that we are not live, the things that I was saying is that during times of change, during times of crisis, where there's very high urgency, we often, and in most cases, look up and call up on our leaders to do their part. And as much as leadership is about doing, it's about acting, it's about advising, knowing certain answers, solutionizing. Leadership is also about being. And one of the important aspects of that being is being emotionally intelligent. And there are many aspects of emotional intelligence. And for the sake of this conversation, we're not going to be unpacking emotional intelligence per se, but we're going to be looking at one of the missed elements of emotional intelligence, which is emotional literacy. And so what I will do at this stage is allow my amazing guests who have bared with me to introduce themselves, tell a little bit about themselves, just so you can see the caliber of people we've got on the stage and on the panel today, and we'll dive straight into the conversation. And Audrey, would you like to kick us off here?
Yes, of course. So I'm Audrey Bron, and I'm a diversity, inclusion, and global communication expert at Bron de Koning and Bron, which is a collaboration between me and my partner, who is also my romantic partner. I give actually more on the side of managing cultural differences, also through the intercultural, from various perspectives of diversity and inclusion. I manage organizations and individuals to become more inclusive, to create that sense of belonging and community within organizations. And one of the things that I use for it is inclusive communication, for example, because I always say communication is everything and everything is communication. If you're looking for solutions for certain things, you start with the interactions and what you want to achieve. And I do this at Bron de Koning and Bron. And my partner, who is an expert in intergenerational diversity, and is also white. I'm a Black woman, he's white. We have various uncomfortable conversations, but it helps. And I always like to connect and link with other people to share those fresh perspectives on diversity and inclusion.
Thank you, Audrey. Suzanne, the stage is all yours.
Yeah, that was a great, many of the things you said, I'm just like, how could I agree more? We're very well suited. So my name is Suzanne Wertheim. I run Worthwhile Research and Consulting. And I am a former professor of linguistic anthropology. And I left in 2011 to found this company because I was very frustrated at all of the very useful insights that linguistic anthropology provides that weren't getting out to the world. And so I too believe that communication is at the heart of everything. And I too really look at and unpack what's going on in interpersonal interactions. And I take the toolkit of my academic field and I bring it to these issues where often, especially when it's intercultural communication and PS, you can speak the same language with the same accent and still be having intercultural communication. There are a lot of times that people think that they're reading somebody else correctly, and they're actually misreading them because of mismatched cultural cues and mismatched cultural norms. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation today because I think we're going to be saying a lot of complementary or overlapping things, and I think that's great.
Yes, because I totally agree with you, what you just said.
Ladies, thank you so much for those wonderful introductions. And again, just to remind anyone who's joining us live today, the chat will be monitored. It is live, so feel free to drop in any comments, any reflections, any questions you might be having, as we will be picking them up during our session. And these two wonderful guests will be picking up your questions as well. So the place where I would love to begin the conversation, and I would like to begin with a disclaimer, first and foremost, that at this point, we are assuming that anyone who's joining us live or on replay has got the basic understanding of emotional intelligence. So we're not going to be unpacking and defining emotional intelligence, but we're going to be sort of diving more into the emotional literacy side. And for that, I would love to sort of go into the emotional literacy a little bit, and specifically to look at what is emotional intelligence. What is emotional literacy, and what has it got to do with leadership? Because today's conversation will be in line with leadership and how emotional intelligence and emotional literacy specifically fits in the context of leadership. Suzanne, would you like to go first here?
Yeah, sure. It's funny because I'm trying to balance all the time. I'm trying to balance pointing out problems and what's negative and what's an obstacle and what you can be actionable about and do a solution for. And so I think what's very interesting about emotional literacy, I mean, it's literacy. It's the ability to, it's literacy applied to the emotional context, right? So, I mean, everything is right there. So it's like being able to read somebody's emotions, being able to recognize somebody's emotions, be able to name somebody's emotions, and being able to read and recognize and name your own emotions is the basic literacy, right? But I have to say from the get-go that this kind of literacy is not taught explicitly most of the time. So people who receive explicit emotional literacy training are often autistic, right? But otherwise, most people are just expected to learn it through the very implicit process of what we call socialization or language socialization, where people learn over time to recognize things through all kinds of like pattern recognition and feedback loops. And I think I would be wrong to not stay right up front that there is an incredibly gendered component to emotional literacy and emotional socialization, and to talk about it in the framework of leadership. So I'm sitting in the US, I'm sitting in California, and so I'm anthropological about things, but I don't want to overstate. So I'm going to be saying things in the US context, right? So like almost everywhere else, the executive suites of most of American companies are overwhelmingly male. And generally, people who are raised as male in this country are not socialized into emotional literacy. So what we have from the get-go is this real problem where we want our leadership to be emotionally intelligent and emotionally literate, but our leadership is majority male, and leadership in the US is very much associated with masculine behaviors and masculine tendencies, and recognizing, naming, discussing, acknowledging emotions is very much seen as feminine women's work, the women's work of caretaking. So just to problematize it right up front, emotional literacy sounds very basic, but there are people, the majority of people in American corporate or company leadership I work with a lot of startups, are people who have been explicitly socialized to not think about their emotions, to not recognize their emotions, and to not be attuned to and have the filter to recognize the emotions of others. I see a lot of nodding, so I'm going to stop right there.
Yes, and I do agree with you, Suzanne, because we are living, most societies are paternalistic societies. So, and that's what it's based on. Because when you talk about emotional literacy and leadership, for people who are emotionally literate, they find themselves in a place of power and empowerment. If you do not have emotional literacy, it can be difficult to come in that space. And emotional literacy doesn't automatically mean, and that's what you were just explaining, doesn't mean that people feel comfortable enough to use it, their emotional literacy. So they do not reach emotional intelligence. So they do have emotional literacy, but they do not reach emotional intelligence. And especially if you are upholding paternalistic values and norms, which are saying that you do not express your feelings in certain ways in society, which makes it complex for people to be in a position of leadership, and instead they are in a position of being a boss. So you're not leading, you're bossing, and you're not really helping other people. So emotional literacy, I think, because earlier you said, Baiba, the expectation, we have the assumption that most people who are here attending this session, they have a minimal knowledge of emotional literacy. But even though I am still going to mention this for the people who do not, who are just curious and just come into the place and just want to know what it is, just want to understand what it is, because they have never ever, they have heard of emotional intelligence, but they have never heard of emotional literacy. Many people have heard of emotional intelligence, but they do not know what the foundation of it is actually. So when we're talking about emotional literacy, we're talking about people who are who have the competency to verbalize what they are feeling and to recognize what other people are feeling, to express what they are feeling, because just saying I'm feeling emotional isn't saying anything. So you need to be able to express what you're feeling in order for someone to help you meet your needs, for someone to help you develop further, for someone to help you do this or that or whatsoever. So the ability to verbalize, for example, I'm sitting here and I feel comfortable sitting here. I feel comfortable. That's a feeling. I'm verbalizing my emotions. I'm sitting here in a space of women where I feel accepted. I know these women. So verbalizing those words. So for the people who did not know what emotional literacy is, that is it. Verbalizing it in order to create meaningful relationships also. And that's a really important part when in emotional intelligence if you're in a leadership position, because leaders, they create relations in order to reach certain objectives that you want to reach, to co-create certain relationships or in work or any type of organization. So that's what emotional literacy does. And as a leader, if you are able to verbalize yourself well, literally to others, then you can help them, because you can also reflect on your own emotions, and you can listen to their emotions to help them. That's actually what you're doing if you're emotionally literate, if you have emotional literacy. But you need to feel comfortable in doing that. I haven't been feeling comfortable. I don't feel comfortable in all groups to verbalize my emotions, because I might be in a group of all white men, and expressing my emotions might not be accepted, because that level of empathy is not there. Whatever I need in my life to reach whatever I'm going to do or to help someone else, the compassion might not be there, because it's not accepted. Because what Suzanne was saying earlier is that we are living in a paternalistic society still.
And just to tag on to that, we tend to avoid very public discussions or open discussions of stigmatized things, identities, stigmatized actions. And there is a stigma in the work world, in the public domains, around emotion, right? So emotion is stigmatized. And here's a linguistic example. If I say of somebody, a colleague, right, oh, she's so emotional, that's an insult. Just like throw like a girl. Like there are a lot of like a girl. You can tell that something is a stigmatized identity when sort of a plain statement, it actually reads as negative. And so there is a strong disincentive to put in effort to acquire competency in something while it is highly stigmatized, when a lot of being a leader is about management of the public perception of yourself. Right. So
Yes.
while it's very necessary for us to be doing this kind of emotional intelligent work, this kind of emotional literacy, in order to be really the most effective leaders we can be, there's also always that stigma that has to be navigated around. And that requires a certain level of security and a certain level of knowledge that a lot of people won't reach, especially in a time of crisis when people will default to like their sort of autopilot behaviors, and especially in a time of time scarcity, which I find that a lot of people have, and even if they don't have, they think they have, because it's the mindset of there isn't enough time to. And, you know, it's 2 years into a global pandemic, longer for people in some locations. For me, it's 2 years. And so time scarcity is very real in a lot of ways because of the ongoing constant uncertainty. So asking people to level up into a very necessary skill set that's also stigmatized when they feel like they don't have time is a very heavy lift. And I work with people often who are 1 or 2 below the executive level. And the clarity that they see, I need my leadership team to XYZ, compared with when I talk to leaders, what they want to have the time for, what they feel capable of, what they're willing to devote time and energy to. There's a real mismatch there.
Ladies, thank you so much for setting such a great scene for our today's conversation. And there is a lot in what you've said that we will unpack today. So thank you for that. And, you know, some of the things that I just want to echo were that emotions or the conversations around emotions are gendered or is a gendered topic, is that we cannot really fully reach emotional intelligence if we do not have emotional literacy. And so, and I do want to piggyback on that a little bit, and especially around what the both of you said, that, you know, to be able to express our emotions, we have to have both the environment to do that, to feel safe and comfortable to do that, but also the internal knowledge and vocabulary ultimately to be able to express what we're feeling. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's quite interesting. Obviously, there's a lot of research that's been done around, you know, emotions and leadership and emotional intelligence and combining all three together. And there was one study by Brene Brown and her research team where they went around the leaders that they have been working with as part of their work, where they studied 17,000 leaders to find out their level of emotional literacy. And bearing in mind that there are, circa 30 emotions or feelings, they found that the average number of feelings or emotions that leaders could express were 3. It was angry, sad, and happy. Angry, sad, and happy. Now, when we talk about leadership, especially over the past 2 years, that the key thing that has been coming out has been leaders need to be more empathetic. They need to show more compassion. They need to be more vulnerable, more courageous. And these are big words, and these words actually mean something. And so even though from definition point of view, we might know what those words mean, what do they actually look like from behavior point of view? And if our average vocabulary for words is angry, sad, and happy, then how can we really show up as a vulnerable, empathetic, compassionate leader? And so I'm curious to how have both of you seen in your consulting work, in your research work, of how emotional literacy or the lack of it shows up in workplaces, in public spaces, or in the world as we see it today. And feel free to jump in.
Audrey, would you like to go first?
First of all, one thing I want to mention is sometimes people do not recognize certain words. They know the emotions, but they do not recognize what it means in words. That's important to understand. So let's put that first. Because before I started in the D&I world, I experienced certain things as cancel culture, gaslighting, etc. I had never heard of those words before, but I have experienced these things. So not knowing a word doesn't mean that you do not know the emotion or do not know how you just do not know the word until someone else starts using a word and you lift on that word and it starts living within you. So words as being vulnerable, or words that people need to learn. And what does it look like? So if I start crying in the workplace, does that mean that I'm vulnerable? It means that you're that what the feeling that you had inside of you, you did not get the possibility to express it until the moment that the last drop that hit the bucket let it overflow. So not being able to verbalize your emotion caused a problem. And it can be in the work, it can be in any situation because you didn't know how to verbalize whatever it is. Be encouraged. There are people who are courageous, but they don't know that whatever it is that what they're doing, that falls in the dictionary under the word, you're now being courageous. And not everyone can be courageous because most people have to learn also to be courageous in life. But how does it show up? I firstly started explaining that emotional literacy is the verbal act of your emotions in order to create meaningful relationships, right? But it also shows up as a process. And the process starts with exploration. What is actually going on here? What am I feeling, or what is that other person feeling? That's what it actually starts with. And it's a constant awareness journey. And you explore that journey. And something can happen in the work with a colleague or from your own perspective that will require of you to sit with yourself or with a colleague and to explore what's going on. So first of all, you are exploring like what just happened. You discuss it with yourself or with someone else. I sometimes speak to myself. That's also a discussion, even if I do it with myself. And then you go to the reflection. What could I have done differently for the next time in the future? Because that's what you want. You do not want to stay in that same position. You do not want to stay in that same state of being or that same state of mind. You want to move beyond. You want to move to something positive. that's also how it shows up. And another thing that happens is once you're in that exploration process, so the discussing with yourself, the reflection, you also need to come to the understanding before you take action. And it's all an emotional state. You're speaking to yourself. And the most important thing is, I do not want to stay in the state that I am in right now. And that is leadership. Leadership wants to move out of a space that is negative, to help people move out of a state that is negative to a state that is more positive. That's one of the things that leadership wants to do. Because at the moment that you move out of that space, you can start evolving. You can discover new things. You can discover how to work together better. You can start creating sense of belonging. Because often when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we also talk about belonging. And in that process of doing so, you create safer spaces where people have the feeling that I can use my emotional literacy. This is a space where I can do so. But you, as a leader, you have to create that space for others in order to verbalize themselves. If that makes sense to the people listening. And that's actually what I then also do in my work. So for myself, because you start with yourself, you're actually, when you use the first aid steps, you always start with making it safe for yourself before you help other people. So make it safe for yourself first, and then you can help other people. You can listen to them, and listen always to understand. So if I have an employee or anyone else come to me from an organization and they want to discuss any topic, the first thing that I have to do is listen to them, to validate whatever it is that they're feeling, or anything that is going on within them or in the organization. That's what I have to do as a leader, and that's what any leader has to do. And from that point on, you can start talking with them. Have I understood well that this is what's going on for you? How did it make you feel? I do not come with my own story. Yeah, I had that. I had that situation too, and I did this and I did that, and blah blah blah. You're not listening. You're not listening to understand a person. Leadership asks for listening to understand. That's a position also of empathy. To listen to understand, and that's where you can move further beyond. And then you're going to use your emotional intelligence skills after you've given them the ability to be safe. So how can I help you? How can we move beyond this? How can we move further? And a person that you speak to cannot always recognize what they need. They can express, they can verbalize their feelings, but that doesn't mean that they immediately know what they need. But if you listen well, you will be able to analyze and help speak to them and move beyond and come with solutions.
Thank you for that. And what stuck out for me the most is literally where you started this conversation with, again, with the conversation, but answering this question around the fact that we feel a lot of emotions, but not necessarily we have the words to label them with. So even if we say vulnerability, we might not necessarily recognize what that vulnerability or courage means or how we display that. And that's where that emotional literacy comes in, because that allows us to regulate ourselves, to acknowledge, to notice, and to also regulate ourselves, and therefore notice certain things also in other people. And that's what leadership is about.
Yes.
Thank you. Suzanne?
I wrote down 5 different things I'm going to see as Alter was talking. I'm like, this one. I'll see which ones I can hit. One of the first things I'll say from my own consulting perspective is an experience is that I work with a lot of tech companies, a lot of STEM companies. I work with finance, medicine, law, tech, and sometimes the interaction of them. And I find from the get-go that people are not even comfortable with what's called qualitative data. So they want numbers. So when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, what I see so often is a focus on hiring and ignoring on the culture that happens when people come into a company. So you can measure the numbers, like who are we bringing in? What was our pipeline and how did we get them in? And they're not even noticing that if you don't have a culture that is inclusive and fosters belonging, it's just a revolving door. And the people that you want to boost up your numbers are just going to go right out the door. So that's one thing, is that even just when I present workshops, I have to figure out when to just throw in enough quantitative data to make people feel happy, because it's like, oh, it's a number, it must be real, right? So that's one thing. So I see that as people coming from sort of a deficit space when it comes to just understanding the human condition and the qualitative aspects of human interactions, which can be looked at in a very precise way, but without numbers involved. So when I work with leaders, and in fact, when I do my foundational anti-bias training, so what I do is I specialize I've transformed a lot of what used to be my college courses and reworked them in different ways to turn them into workshops. So here's some of the stuff that students would email me 8 years later and be like, Professor Wertheim, I'm still thinking about this. And I'm like, ooh, you took my intro class 8 years ago and you still remember? So to me, that says that sticks with people and that lands, right? So I'm like, how can I get that to people? What I've done is I Trojan horse emotional stuff in the guise of science. I mean, it is science, right? But I literally, the thought of emotion can be so paralyzing to people. And I have some friends who are engineers and executives, and we'll hike together. I'm like, hey, I had this idea for this executive training of this empathy-based exercise. And like, oh no, I wish I could remember because I was hiking, so I didn't have my notepad. But they're like, here's what the response is going to be. Like, if you said that to me, I'd be like, emotions are terrifying. I can't this. I'm going to shut down. I'm going to get defensive. Like, they went through the whole thing. And so I tend to focus on scaffolding people up through what I call cognitive skills, like perspective taking. You're like, how does emotional literacy show up and not show up? I'm like, so we call it scaffolding in pedagogy. Like, how do you make it so people, like if the place you're trying to get them to is here and they have this level of knowledge, do you like take a leap? No, you build a ladder and you're like, go up step by step. Well, the first steps that I do are cognitively based rather than being discussed as emotion. So one of the biggest things that I talk about is perspective taking, because perspective taking is so important when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. And I point out, so here's a freebie for everybody here. You didn't have to pay for the training. Perspective taking has two components, and most people focus only on one. So the first component of perspective taking is there's a scenario, and here's you, and here's the other person. And so it's just doing a switch. In the same scenario, if I was in that position, how would I feel? And this is when a lot of people, because I focus a lot about language, a lot of people will say to me something like, well, I wouldn't mind if someone said it to me. And I'm like, aha, step two. Step two is, what if you were in this person's position and you had their lived experience? Because what we know is that different lived experience leads to different emotional and other reactions to the same situation. So two people can come to the same situation, and depending on how their lifetime of accumulated experience, a word can land for one person and be like, oh, I have no problem being called articulate. And another person is like, oh, articulate has just been used as an insult, a subtle insult, so many times that even when someone's genuinely complimenting me, it just doesn't sound good anymore. It's been such a bad word. So, and even that people will find difficult or problematic. And so just to bring in, for example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been a lot of talk in my LinkedIn spaces where people will say, why does the West have empathy for the Ukrainian situation, but they're not mentioning global South? So all these different, like Syria, Gaza, Africa is just ignored where I live. It's just like, it's not even a place, right? So why does that happen? And so for me, it's very obvious. It's because people are very used to taking that first step. Oh, it's another white person who's middle class and a software engineer. It's so easy to look and be like, now that person's terrified, they're running for their life, this, that, the other, but they haven't been able to do that second step. And so there are even like these most basic concepts that undergird empathy that are, again, cognitive skills that I'm like, let's up level you. And I'll give you another example. So the second, I have this foundational course. So the first one is called The Language of Bias, where what I find is so many people literally can't even see bias. It doesn't feel real to them, because if you're a member of a lot of dominant groups, you've only had one. The mainstream perspective is the one that you've had, and you just haven't had, I call it a data deficit. A lot of people have a data deficit, and they haven't been able to create accurate mental models of the world because they haven't been able to access the data that the three of us, we're all minorities in different ways, or I don't like the word minority, but there are ways in which we've had a mainstream perspective and then our lived experience, and they've been different from birth. So there are ways that we have, all three of us on this thing, a lifetime of accumulated experience that lets us know, oh, there's also another way. But if you've grown up where I live, like white, male, heterosexual, you were assigned male at birth and you still feel male, you're Christian, the world has been set up to present, to mirror to you only your perspective, and you haven't had the ability to see that other people's lives are different and they haven't had access to the same things, or there might be another way of looking at things. So literally the first introductory training I do, and I often do it to a leadership with not to a leadership team, with a leadership team first, is just be like, bias is real. Here's how to recognize it. Here's a 7-point taxonomy. Use this taxonomy. I sometimes don't say so, depending on the crowd. I'm like, here's a checklist, but you can use this taxonomy to describe any kind of bias that shows up in an interpersonal interaction. Done. And then in the second one, we talk about what I call rupture and repair, because microaggressions are another place where emotional literacy or the absence of literacy fails people, where something, I don't use the term microaggression anymore, because for people on the receiving end, it often doesn't feel micro. I'm like, okay, you kicked somebody in the knee by mistake, but it was their 500th kick in the knee. So when they explode, I'm like, you have to understand that it was the 500, like, did the thing that you do, was it small? Yeah. Is it the 500th time somebody's had that particular pain point hit? Yeah. So I set people up to talk about a rupture instead of a micro, also aggression. People who think they have good intentions and who do have good intentions will not internalize the word aggression, and it will cause them to resist. So I'm always thinking about, how do you sneak in so things feel appealing to people, right? So instead, I have this framework from therapeutic psychology called, actually, and originally child psychology, called rupture and repair. The rupture is someone has said or done something problematic, or out in the world, there's a problematic thing being said or done. And then how do you go through the process to accurately identify what it is, have a discussion, and repair it? And I literally have learned that I have to remove anything explicitly about emotion from this introductory training in order for it to land appropriately. This is the level of sort of emotional remedial work that has to happen. And so I give people a model called Situation Behavior Impact that's been designed by an institute. I forget the name. I should give them credit. It's on the sheet. But I'm like, literally, here's the situation. Like, you describe the situation, you describe the behavior, and then it's implied that in the impact, that's when the feelings come. But I literally don't talk about it because I've had to scale back over the years of doing these trainings. So that is my insight into where emotional literacy does and doesn't show up. And basically, to sum up, when you want people, especially in leadership positions, and leadership can mean people with organizational power or people with social power, people who expect to be paid attention to and listened to, people who are in those power positions, I find that I literally sneak in, I Trojan horse in emotional stuff in the guise of more scientific things, even though there's very to discuss and analyze emotions is very scientific. People just don't see it as a science or a technical skill set.
I agree with you on that, Susan. Most people don't perceive it as that. And of course, then you will have to use the Trojan horse. Sometimes you just have to do what is necessary in order to make people understand the importance of the work that they're doing and to understand the position of the work that they accepted to take because you became a manager, you took a leadership position, doesn't mean that people understand what it means to be a leader or a manager. So they need to be educated because one of the things that I say during the inclusive communication master classes that I do is explain that while we, as mature people, we are still raising ourselves, or we are still being raised through the influences of the people that we come into contact with. We are never done being raised just because our bodies have matured, because our mind has not reached that level of maturity perhaps yet, because not some people are born with emotional literacy. I have a niece, she's 8 years now, and she's really well capable of explaining the way she feels depending on how safe she feels. So not everyone is raised with it, and not everyone is educated to the extent to understand what it is and how to use it in their work, and to understand the authority or the responsibility that comes with their work, with what they're doing. So you sometimes indeed you have to sneak that Trojan horse.
And I want to tag on. I want to tag on to that because the idea of being raised is also, I talk about this in my training where I talk about stress responses. So it's very undercounted. A lot of people are raised by parents who make emotions illegitimate, and in particular, the child's emotions. So if you were raised by narcissistic parents, abusive parents, emotionally neglectful parents, it comes from intergenerational trauma. A lot of people, and here the gender is going away, but a lot of people are raised in a way where very subtly from infancy, they're told by their caretakers that their emotions aren't valid and they need to stuff them down, and it's very scary responses. And so I say to people, you are entitled. Everyone is entitled to have a strong stress response if somebody comes to them and says, I'd like to tell you that there's something that you said that was problematic. You are entitled to say to them, I need at least 2 days to process this, because it can take 2 full days for adrenaline and cortisol to leave your system, stress hormones to leave your system. I don't really like to say hormones to men because hormones are gendered as female. So I've started to say, I started to actually name the stress hormones, right? So there's this way that a lot of people, and I have to say, you are entitled to a stress response. Like, stress responses are valid, but you've got to come back 2 or 3 days later and then deal with the stuff.
Yes, you have that right. You take that right. You have it. Because if you cannot just sit there with your emotions, because it's not even healthy. It's not good for your overall well-being. It's just not healthy. You need to process it. What a person said this or that to me, how does it make me feel? It's a valid thing to do. There's nothing wrong with that at all. You are a human being. You're not a robot, right?
And the other thing is that by the time someone has the courage to come to you, they've sat with something for a long time, but it's new information for you, right?
Exactly.
So you're entitled to have, but again, this can throw people into, and in my experience, so I have multiple stories from leadership that I use in my trainings, but to get feedback from someone beneath you that you have said or done something problematic will very often generate a strong anger response. And I have many stories where somebody was told, they try to figure out, well, who's the right person to come in. And so a female executive comes in to tell a male executive, hey, there was a problematic thing around gender. Sometimes it's been live streamed to a global audience, and multiple times I've heard stories where somebody says, like balling up their fists in anger and says, "Get out of my office," and literally shuts down and won't take the feedback because their emotional literacy levels are so low. And also there's anger that's generated. It is just a human thing. When someone beneath us acts like they're on our level, it's very human to get very angry from that. And so this is a very common thing that I train on. But yeah, people, sometimes the stress response shows up as anger, and then it stays as anger, and then people don't progress. And the problematic thing they said or did is just out there, and it's never resolved.
I like what you said, Suzanne, beneath, someone being beneath you. In leadership, no one is beneath you. In a manager position, no one is being beneath you because you're helping coach someone, you're helping mentoring someone, you're helping someone to improve the position where they're in to come into a better position than what they were in yesterday, today, to tomorrow. So that word of being beneath already means that you're in a position where you do not understand what your position is. That's how I perceive it.
And that, I think, 100%. And I think that also goes back to how we define leadership. Whether we define leadership as someone who recognizes someone's potential and their role is to unleash it and improve it, or whether leadership is, as Suzanne mentioned earlier, someone with social power or organizational power. So this is, again, yes, talking about the whole notion of leadership, there's a lot to unpack in that, bag or pocket alone. But I would love to, there are quite a few things going on in the chat, and quite a few people have joined us and are just reflecting that what you ladies are talking about is making a lot of sense. Samantha is saying active listening is very important, and she's asking a question: how about those above you, again beneath above you, who are not actively listening and do not hold the same emotional intelligence skills? Big question, Samantha, and I don't know if any of you ladies have got a quick answer to this before we sort of move on. Probably that's what I thought, but hopefully, Samantha, the conversation that we are having is helping, and as we come to conclusion of our conversation, we'll be sharing some tips as well around emotional literacy. So stay with us. And so I just want to piggyback on some of the things that both of you have already said. So Suzanne, you've just talked about that feeling of I am angry, get out of the office. And early on, Audrey, what you talked about and the example you mentioned is about I am emotional. What does that even mean? And another great one is I'm stressed. And we say that a lot. We say that about everything. And these are big umbrella terms. And we use these umbrella terms to label any other emotion that we might be feeling. We say I'm stressed, and then everything becomes stressed. Everything becomes I'm stressed. But until we start unpacking that and really pinning down what are we actually trying to say here, because we might be saying I'm disappointed, or I don't feel supported here, or I am worried about a difficult situation or a difficult conversation and I'm avoiding it. But we say I'm stressed. And when we use these big terms as I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm happy, we lose our ability to deal with the problem, with the issue, with the root cause. Where is this coming from? And this is where this emotional literacy comes in, right? Because by appropriately labeling our emotions, which you both have eloquently already talked about, we can recognize what is at the root cause, and we can attend ourselves first. And what it is that I'm actually feeling, and we can then start regulating ourselves with more accuracy. So this is where in the context of emotional literacy and intelligence, we start talking about emotional agility, and how this emotional agility helps in moments of change and in moments of crisis that we have, that we find ourselves in today. And I would love to hear from either of you, both of you, what you think, how this emotional literacy feeds into agility, and how does that help us as leaders through moments of change, which we face every single day. It doesn't have to be a turmoil crisis what we are in right now, but also we are where we are.
I like what you said about the root cause. If you want to handle crisis or change, you always need to go to the root cause. What is causing this crisis? What is the change that I want to achieve within X period of time or whatever? The root cause, exactly what you said. So then again, you come in that process of exploration in order to handle that. And it can be, for some people, it can be challenging, especially if you're just getting in the beginning phase of emotional literacy, to understanding all those feelings that are happening, whatever is going on in that crisis. But you always start with the root cause before you get to the solution. That's how simple it is.
I want to focus more on other orientation. So I want to say, so to go back to the active listening thing, I feel like there's this complex that happens that allows people to be emotionally agile if they're able to collect data. This isn't here, so I'm an anthropology, right? But how do you get past the thing where you're stuck in your own perspective and you may not be able to self-reflect? How do you make it so that people, there's a psychological safety and you can elicit feedback from people and genuinely hear how people feel, how something is landing, how it's going? And so, for example, I hear complaints from people who aren't at the leadership level, I mean, executive, C-suite level, when a company remains silent, especially internally, when there is a big crisis, right? So we had 2 summers ago the police murder of George Floyd, homicide, murder of George Floyd, and then a lot of companies stayed silent or maybe made a statement that was external but didn't check in with. I heard from a lot of Black people that nobody checked in with them. There was a lot of silence. There was a lot of, I think people were paralyzed by fear and were unable to be agile, emotionally agile. And so I think one of the best things to be emotional agile or a leader in crisis is to have set up ways to figure out, not on your own, what people around you are feeling and what they need, right? And then be able to, so this is why people are like, well, why do you need a diverse executive team? Well, if you've got a Black executive, they can be like, oh, hold up, we got to give people time off. Or there are all these ways that having other voices in the room where people are on the same power level and so more empowered to talk about emotions are able to bring things up. And so I think that I think that's one of the biggest keys to emotional agility and leadership is allowing people to be human with you and feel safe talking to you so you can gather data and be like, oh, this is more important than I thought. From my perch, this doesn't feel like a big thing, but it feels, but I'm learning for other people, this feels very big. And so I should take action on it.
Suzanne, is it, because that's a question that comes up for me, is it that they are paralyzed by fear? Or is it that they are paralyzed by the work that they will have to do in order to help other people move out of a position? You know, sometimes you also talk about allyship, which is a totally other topic, but we talk about allyship and performative allyship. So you put that small sentence because something really bad happened, or you change your profile picture, you make it black, or now in the case of Ukraine, where they change the color of their profile. Well, Black people are being hurt in a position, or people of underrepresented groups, or have a different color, or not Ukrainian, or whatsoever. Is it that they are paralyzed by fear, or paralyzed by the work that they will have to do because they think it's so much work? It's so much work to be human.
I think it's a combo. In my experience, people are afraid to talk about the hardest stuff in the world. So it's so funny because people are like, to be called racist or sexist or homophobic is like one of the worst things in the world. But also they don't care enough to actually do the work to make it so that they
Yes.
don't get called that. So this is at the very crux. I mean, there's so many people after George Floyd who reached out for training, and I wrote up all these proposals and they're like, oh, that's how much a training costs. By the way, not that much. I was still undercharging at the time. Like, that's how much a training costs? We can't pay that. I'm like, are you freaking kidding me? Like, you're not willing to do one training session. So I'm wrestling with that all the time. I think it's a fear of looking stupid, but not enough fear I think we need to make it more painful for it has to become more painful for people to be paralyzed than to actually take action. Like somehow we need to reach a tipping point where people realize they actually have to put their fear aside and put in the effort and do the work.
Yeah.
Totally echo that, and a lot of people in the chat have also said that they're really enjoying this discussion, because emotional literacy is very needed today, because we need to learn how to deal with different kinds of people. And I'll add to that, deal with ourselves first and then deal with other kinds of people. But absolutely. And Yisha, I hope I said your name right, Yisha, is asking, how do you navigate through emotional literacy or thereof lack of when you are dealing with executive leadership? Execs that just want to check the box in the DEI space and not create actual change. Are there any strategies or tips to still move the needle in spite of? Thank you for the question, Yisha, because we are literally, as we're running out of time, I would say, we are literally moving into sharing sharing a couple of tips on that. So thank you for the question. And so to, again, piggyback on Yisha's question, what are the one or two key tips that you would share, that you would say are great ways of evolving our emotional literacy today? Things, simple things that we can start doing today that doesn't require big, maybe expensive training sessions on emotional literacy in the whole piece, but some of the things that we can start doing within our own comfort zones today.
What I'm going to say right now might sound as manipulation and as a Trojan horse.
Please chuck one in.
Any organization has a mission and a vision. Who are we? And where do we see ourselves? And often the mission and the vision are so well and beautifully written, but it's not what's going on inside the organization. And this is not for sure the solution that you're looking for, perhaps, but you print that out and you show it to them and you tell them, this is what you want us to achieve. We want to be an organization that supports blah, blah, blah. We are supporting diversity and inclusion. We are supporting this and that. We are doing such and such and so. But people are not listening to me. I have signed a contract when I came to this organization. And actually, when you sign that contract to come to that organization, the organization has the responsibility to make sure that you are safe, that you are emotionally and physically safe. That's what they actually signed for. The moment that you walk into that building, be it virtually or physically, because many people are now working hybrid from home or in the office, it's their responsibility. So I say it's a bit of manipulation, because then you are moving away from the I, because emotional literacy, the first step to start with it is speaking from the I position. I feel such and so. The moment that you use I feel such and so, or you make me feel, you are holding a mirror. So you're turning the mirror around, and it becomes a you thing. You make me feel, but sometimes it's necessary. So our vision and mission says this, but that is not what I'm feeling. So you have to start speaking from your own emotional literacy. So you need to develop that one in order to get other people to come with you. I do not feel safe, which is a big word. I do not feel safe, blah, 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 because of this, while our mission and our vision is saying this and that. Because of this, and that. The most important thing that you can do for yourself in an organization is speak of how you have felt when you were with that organization, not when you have left, not when you leave, because then it's already done, it's already past, but while you're still in that organization. Because by doing so, knowingly, you might be helping someone else out who is not that courageous yet. And I'm saying yet, because sometimes certain things we still have to learn them. How do I speak bravely? How do I speak courageous? How do I speak with my heart all the way in my throat, saying the things that I'm feeling at this point about my organization, because I am not satisfied, because you are not protecting me the way you should be protecting me within the organization when I signed that contract with you. So I'm now saying a lot of big things, perhaps for certain people, but sometimes it's necessary to call your executive, your manager, your leader to accountability, even if they don't want to listen.
I'd like to jump in and say that for some people, it's too dangerous. I love everything. So
Yes.
I offer a service. I'm not trying to sell it. I'm just explaining that here's a thing that can happen, right?
No,
So,
you should. You should tell them what you have, because that's
okay.
what they're asking. They're
So
asking
I offer,
any strategies or tips.
oh, there you go.
Sell it. Sell it.
I offer a service called a culture audit, where I go in and I use an interview protocol, and I do basically anthropological interviews with people for between 45 minutes and an hour and a half. Generally, it's scheduled for an hour, and I ask a series of questions that are designed to elicit employee experience. And I'll say things like, has there ever been a time you didn't feel seen? Has there been a time that you felt like you were being treated as lower than your actual position? Has there ever been a time that you felt like you were being excluded from stuff? So just basic stuff. Then I write a very long report, and then I use quotes. And what I find is the quotes are what get people, because the executives do not believe that people in their company feel this way or have had these experiences. And I'll tie that into, so this is what we were talking about very early on, is the idea of being listened to. Sometimes you have to have a third party, because I anonymize everything. So if I'm talking to a British person, they say fortnight, I take it out and I say 2 weeks. Like if it's for an American firm, like there are all these ways that I protect people's identity so they can speak freely with me. And then I give an unvarnished summary to people. And in parallel, something that I wasn't at, but I heard a lot about, a client of mine had a Black affinity group, an employee resource group, and they did that data among themselves. They collected experiences, and then they, as part of like the national meeting, they kept a few executives and they had them sit with them, and then the executives read in the I voice, right? They just read the quotes. I was very upset when, and then they read racist, like all the things. And the people who were there said people were trembling, the executives trembling, shaking, freaking out. But of the 3 executives who were there, I saw noticeable changes in moving from non-allyship, let alone performative allyship, into actually doing real ally work. So reading somebody else's bad experience in the I voice aloud seemed to have made an impact. So any way that you can get trick executives into reading it or doing it, not trick, I mean like hire someone like me or get something like that where executives are reading real quotes from people, and everybody thinks, well, it's not happening here, it's not us. So that's the big thing. But Baba, you were like, what's a lighter lift we can do? So I'm going to just say, diversify all your media feeds very intentionally. And this is what I say to my executive teams too, right? So diversify your feeds, diversify what you stream, whatever you're on, like LinkedIn, who you follow, Instagram, I lose track, TikTok, like whatever. Make it so that you are very purposefully adding every week, like 5 people from like, okay, now I'm going to look at people who are this. Now I'm going to look at people who are that. And then be consistent, because having that feed come in, I know when I first was on Twitter, I was so surprised by people's reactions that were so different from mine. I was like, oh, that didn't feel like a big deal to me. And then Black Twitter's like, what? And I'm like, ooh, I guess it was a big deal, right? So there are ways that this is, I love data and the brain, and the more you can get your brain better data, the more your brain can do some of that work for you and create better mental models that make you more literate. So that's my light lift. You can start right now.
Thank you so much for that. And I'll try to add another, hopefully a light lift. And I will say, feel all your emotions, because we have this mindset of, not necessarily mindset, we have this mantra these days of positive emotions only. And well-being is all about reaching the goal of being happy. And even though there are more conversations about, feeling all of your emotions, we are still preaching to the good emotions and working towards good emotions. I'm going to do air quotes on that, and working towards not allowing the bad ones in. But there are no inherently good or bad emotions. And having this mindset about good versus bad feelings robs us from emotional agility, because then we are not curious. We are rigid. And this rigidity leads to fragility. And this, obviously, the fragility piece, obviously something that we talk a lot in context of leadership, and especially in context of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and moving from fragility to agility by not categorizing your feelings into good and bad ones. Because, as I said, no one standalone feeling is good or bad, but create space for yourself to get curious, to explore, to learn about yourself, to notice and to accept whatever is coming up without good and bad judgment. And this will pave the way for you and support you in leaning into difficult conversations, articulating yourself better, building the muscle of agility that is so needed, especially as we lead through change, which we do, which every leader does, and every leader needs to be able to do, and especially now as we lead through crisis.
Exactly.
So with that, I would love to close our today's conversation, unless, ladies, you have any final words, any final things that you wanted to send our audience away with today. Thank you so much. And I want to remind that we're going to be meeting next week, same place, different time. And the next week's topic will be around intercultural intelligence and communications, that will just be building up and on top of what we have been talking about today. So I just want to say a huge thank you to both of you for taking the time out, for waking up early, for staying up a little bit later to join us, and to everyone and anyone who has joined us today, who bear with us while we were switching between platforms and technical problems. And I see lots of thank yous. Adjo was saying, is it so much work to be human, so powerful? I think one of you ladies said that, and that's also a beautiful way to finish this. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and for anyone who might be watching us on replay. We'll see you next week, and thank you, ladies, for being here with me and for all the insights that you shared. And both ladies are consultants, and as they already alluded, they are available for having conversations about the amazing services and workshops that they offer. So make sure that you connect and reach out to them. Thank you so much. Take good care.